This is Counter-Narrative News on the 2nd of January 2023. Today, Russia has suffered an attack by Ukrainian forces in the east of Ukraine in the Donetsk region. Kiev is alleging that they have killed several hundred soldiers, up to 400, and injured another 300. In the fog of war, we have to treat this with some skepticism, but even if a fraction of that is correct, then the Russians have suffered a demoralizing attack. And it's been reported, well, the Russians have not denied it, the attack that is, and it's been reported that the people targeted in the Russian armed forces are new conscripts. It's well known that Russia has recruited some of 250,000 conscripts, including vast numbers of prisoners, and one can only imagine what these conscripts who have received next to no training and very little equipment how are they conducting themselves in the operation of conflict in the Ukrainian context. Also, Russia continues to bomb urban areas across Ukraine, including the capital Kiev, including the use of Iranian-made Shahed drones. It's perhaps quite sad to see the Iranians contribute this across the world in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. One would have thought, considering what's happening internally in Iran, that Iran would actually conduct itself in a hearts and minds campaign across the world, but that's not the case. But it's no surprise that Russia is hugging Iran so closely, because recently China has just concluded a $300 billion gas deal with close Western client state and a Gulf monarchy in Qatar. So Russia absolutely needs the ally in Iran with its energy resources for itself. In other news, the IMF chief, Mrs. Georgieva, has warned that 2023 will continue to see great economic pressures being pressed upon the global labouring people. This is obviously bad news for the labouring people across the world, because they've obviously suffered particularly intense degradation of their living standards and attack on their wages and conditions this last couple of years particularly. Going over to the southern half of the American continent, Lula has been sworn into the presidency in Brazil. It's a very positive occasion for many Brazilians, with the slogan "Love Conquers All" being part of the kind of political culture which is very counter-distinctive to the previous President Bolsonaro and his hard-right or far-right government project. Lula was in tears in his inaugural speech. He was flanked by a young African Brazilian and also someone from one of the native tribes. Lula broke down several times in his inaugural speech, particularly when he referenced the poor who are begging in the streets, indicating Lula's long-standing track record of advocating for the poorest in Brazil from his time when he was a militant trade union leader. Also, staying in Brazil, it's the farewell ceremony with a guard of honor by the Brazilian authorities for the kind of most famous and most skilled footballer that there ever was, Pele. Pele is a contradictory figure. On the one hand, he did not push back on the Brazilian military dictatorship in the 80s, and in some senses of the word, he was actually an ambassador for it and embellished some of its more unethical practices. However, on the other hand, Pele, in the context of Brazil and globally, was very much a very profound and powerful and inspiring figure of what black people could achieve. Now to the UK. An ongoing crisis of the National Health Service continues, with a spike of different infections and colds and flus and other illnesses going into the hospital. Many argue that this is a deliberate policy by the now more than a decade-long Tory administration, which is running down the NHS and then to attempt to justify its continuing privatization, something that people are seeing across the public sector in Britain. Now to Andrew Tate. There's reports that since the onset of the pandemic, many boys have been consuming the toxic, deeply hard right, misogynistic, racist politics of Andrew Tate. And the people in the education system in Britain, many senior people in the administration of schools and other teachers are ringing the alarm bells that there is a tsunami of pro-Andrew Tate, misogynistic, arrogant behavior in schools, including sexual assaults and peaking racism as well. So the ongoing influence of toxic far-right politics continues to spread amongst children through our education system, which is cause for some alarm. Finally, there is a walrus, the creature of the sea, that has decided to make its temporary home in the northern Yorkshire seaside town of Scarborough at the port. The walrus has been hanging out at portside, and in order not to scare off the walrus, the new year fireworks celebrations were cancelled. It's an interesting reflection to think that on the one hand, the people of Scarborough and North Yorkshire and the local authorities there are looking after this walrus with such love, care and attention, whereas if it was men and children from a war zone on a small boat, many of the same people and local state would be seeking to scapegoat and criminalize these very vulnerable people in an attempt to deflect what's happening collectively to people in the cost of living crisis. Please like, subscribe and share, and please ask any questions or critique going forward. Thank you.